Welcome to this program on Constructivism and Online Learning. This is a MOOC program in a series of programs that we are presenting. As we had said in the introduction to the program, that we will also be presenting some of the important learning theories and their implications for online learning. Some of the theories that would be presented is behaviorism, cognitivism, constructivism and connectivism, and some of the learning theories and some of the very important psychologists. In this program, we will be talking about constructivism and online learning. Subsequent to this, we will talk about connectivism. Sometimes it is called as a part of constructivism, but connectivism and online learning. What you see on your screen is that constructivism is both a philosophy and psychology. Some would argue that constructivism is not a learning theory as such, but as we will see in this program, that constructivism significantly contributes to improvement of our understanding of how human beings learn and how learning environments can be organized, and more importantly, in online learning, how this is more applicable in organizing learning environments, both individual as well as group learning. As we had seen earlier in the introduction to the program, that both individual reflection and group reflection are important to one understanding and construction of meaning of anything, that and internalization of that meaning. So therefore, constructivism would significantly contribute insofar as this aspect is concerned. Let us first get into understanding what constructivism is all about. It is said that it is both a philosophy and a psychology. As you see on your screen, that it is both a philosophy and psychology. Constructivism, as it is emanated today, and it is more applicable by psychologists and educators and trainers, has developed over a period of time, over a decade. Even it started with the last decade. John Dewey, Hazel, Kant, Vico and many others who contributed towards development of this construct and its application in teaching and learning. It combines both subjectivism and relativism. Relativism states that reality exists separate from the experience, that something outside, and relativism is basically contributing to, and objectivism basically contributing to the behaviorist theory of learning, that knowledge exists outside, and therefore the knowledge has to be presented to the individual student or to the individual such that one has to learn from outside. So relativism would simply say that reality which exists outside from the individual, and therefore one has to experience that knowledge. Subjectivism would simply say that reality can only be understood through one's own experience. So there is a basic distinction between relativism and subjectivism, and both combined together have significantly contributed to our understanding of constructivism today. What could be the tenets of constructivism? That what you see on your screen is three, and there will be one more construct, four constructs that contribute to fundamental understanding of constructivism today. That one, that knowledge is not passive, but is actively cognized by individuals. That knowledge which exists outside, of course it exists outside as the first tenet of constructivism. It exists outside, but when an individual has to acquire that knowledge, that one has to actively engage with that knowledge. Two, that one has to adapt one's own cognition to environmental viability, in the sense that if the knowledge exists outside, it is its own artifacts, it is its own processes, and it is its own structure, and one has to organize one's own cognitive structure such that it becomes compatible with or equivalent with the structures of the external knowledge, and therefore the facilitation of learning takes place. This is an important consideration, and this could be extended insofar as social construction is concerned, that you will see later. Number three, that the cognitive structure of one's own individual works to make sense of one's experience. So therefore, representation of reality different from person to person. That when knowledge exists outside, that one has to organize one's own cognitive structure, and that cognitive structure has to work with the knowledge which is outside, and working of that cognitive structure, and therefore meaning that is emanating out of the working of that cognitive structure differs from individual to individual, and therefore Not only twins would differ in their perception and interpretation of external knowledge which exists outside, but also their own creation would differ, and the creation of one's own may not actually represent or match with the reality that exists. So therefore, one's own understanding may not be exact representation of true reality that exists outside. So therefore, one's understanding could be sometimes more than reality, less than reality, or could simply match with reality, but it is certainly not equivalent to the reality that exists outside. Sometimes it can be, but individuals would differ in their representation of the meaning of reality that exists outside. And number 4, that you would see that knowledge and knowing depends on bio-neurological construction and socio-cultural linguistic interactions. Vygotsky's contribution is very significant here, and so also many social psychologists who have significantly contributed to this. Over a period of time, it has been observed that the neurological, mental, and especially the nervous system, as they operate differently between individuals. Therefore, the process of knowing would depend on how one is constructing the neurological processes within, and how the neurological process within an individual operates, and that neurological process of the individual interacting with the sociological, social, cultural, and linguistics, because language plays an important role in transmitting and communicating what exactly one feels like, one thinks, or one reflects, or one thinks. So therefore, linguistic, cultural, and social, all these interactions are very much important in interacting with the individual construction of meaning, and therefore social negotiation of meaning. These two aspects are very critical. The fourth one, this fourth tenet, is very critical to the contribution of understanding of constructivism as a science of learning. People would argue that constructivism is not a theory of learning, but it is certainly a science of learning in the sense that it significantly brings in to the fore scientifically with evidences that how social, cultural, and linguistic artifacts, when they interact with the individual cognitive structure, they would significantly contribute to one's own understanding and interpretation and meaning making to whatever external knowledge exists. So therefore, to conclude from the 4 tenets, that knowledge is subjective, certainly, and there is an active cognitive process involved in this, and one has to adapt to the situation that exists outside, and both individual and social interactions are important to finally reach what is called an understanding by oneself, and therefore one can internalize that, and that becomes part of the cognitive structure. There are 3 types of constructivism that have been basically distinguished: cognitive constructivism, radical constructivism, and social constructivism. First, about cognitive constructivism. As we have seen earlier, that cognitive constructivists would believe that knowledge is certainly external, reality is independent of individuals, and therefore the process of knowing it depends on how accurately that internalization takes place, the internalization of reality that exists outside, how accurately as an individual I could internalize that and I could reconstruct myself. So therefore, the first point is that knowledge is certainly external, and one's own mental structures need to be adjusted such, and therefore this is the part of learning, teaching and learning, that one's own mental structure has to be adjusted such that it is to exactly match with the reality or the structure of reality or the knowledge that exists outside, and therefore one learns better. So therefore, number 2, that congruence of the cognitive process and structures of oneself to the real world cognitive processes and structures is very important. So the knowledge has its own structures and processes which exist outside, and therefore the individual's cognitive structures and processes need to be such that it has to match with, or it has to be equivalent, or it has to talk to the processes and structures of the knowledge that exist outside, and therefore learning takes place. Therefore, learning would be that recognition of the structures and processes of knowledge that exist outside, internalization and reconstruction of that reality which exists outside. So therefore, representation of content in mind and how they are learned is very important. that the content that is being provided in teaching learning process, that content has to be based on the reality that exists outside, but that content has to be designed such that how this will be matching with one's own individual mental structures and processes, and therefore one learns better. So therefore, a lot of research that have taken place in learning, memory, cognition, neurological models of the brain, and so on and so forth have significantly contributed. Of course, learning, memory, cognition are not prerogatives of constructivism as such, but then the constructivist oriented research on learning, memory, cognition, and so on and so forth have significantly contributed that how best content and teaching learning could be designed such that it will be matching with external reality and the structures and processes of external reality, and therefore one learns more effectively. And some of the strategies that are available today to us, the advanced organizers, concept maps, transfer of learning, reading strategies like SQ3R, problem solving like IDEAL, and so on and so forth would be very significant insofar as teaching learning processes or design of teaching learning processes and environments are concerned. It is very important that interaction with external forms is mediated by senses. What is learned by may not be accurate representation of reality. So therefore, interaction is very important. Interaction with the external objects, external situations, external events, external contexts is very important, and therefore one's interaction with outside could be as best as possible, but which may not represent the reality outside that exists. Meaning thereby one's own understanding of reality could not be or may not be exactly what reality is, and therefore reality could differ from one's own understanding, and even twins would differ in their understanding of reality. So this is what is a complex fabric or network within which constructivism, cognitive constructivism operates. It depends on context of activity, particular goal to be achieved, and therefore learning is filling in rather than matching with external reality. So it is not a question of match with external reality. External reality exists, but learning would involve that one has to fill in within oneself one's own cognitive structure and cognitive processes, fill in abilities and processes that would facilitate understanding of external reality, rather than that one would be simply matching with external reality. So therefore, it is important that filling in is more important than matching with. Let us distinguish this cognitive constructivism from what is called radical constructivism. It is exactly opposite to cognitive constructivism. Besides assuming what the cognitive constructivism does, radical constructivism recognizes, in fact, that cognitive organizes and cognition organizes and makes sense of one's own experience. So therefore, it is important that it is not only matching with external reality or filling in one's own ability to understand external reality, but more importantly that the cognitive structure has to organize and reorganize and has to working through one's own experience. So therefore, two things are very important here, that cognitive reorganization, reformulation within oneself, and matching of that or working of cognitive reorganization through some experience. So therefore, experience and learning as important as organization of one's own cognitive structure, and teaching learning has to take this into account. And therefore, social experience is important source of knowledge, individual on the one hand and society on the other. So individual cognitive structure interacting with social experience. So therefore, individual understanding and experience in social activity is very important. That's what is important for radical constructivism. Now let us get into social constructivism. This lies between cognitive constructivism and radical constructivism. Of course, it does take into consideration the cognitive as well as radical constructivism. What it simply differs or extends the entire understanding and the process is that knowledge is a result of social construction and linguistic use. This is very important, that whatever understanding one has, that understanding has to be within social negotiation or working together and making meaning in context, in social context. So therefore, group learning is very important, community learning experience is very important, working together is very important, and whatever comes out as a meaning in working together, one has to accept that and one has to internalize, and one could also in the process individually, all the individuals contribute to that meaning making. And most important instrumentality for that is language, and language is very important insofar as communication is concerned. One's own understanding is communicated through language. It is a written language or verbal language or a mediated language or technology mediated language, whatever the case may be. It can be synchronous or asynchronous insofar as online learning is concerned. But then social interaction and language use is very important. Number 3, that there is a shared experience along with individual experience, that whatever individual experience is in the process of learning, in the process of knowing, interaction with the external environment, there is a shared experience with the community of practitioners, there is a shared experience with the group or the peers. That shared experience along with one's own individual experience really together contribute to meaning making and one's own learning. This is an important ingredient which social constructivists propose over and above cognitive and radical constructivism, and therefore socio-cultural context is very important. This is bound to be specific time and space, because what is learned in a specific time in a specific context would be different from if it is learned in a different time and in a different context, and therefore context becomes very important in learning, and therefore designing of the context is also part of the designing of the learning process, teaching learning environment and teaching learning process and teaching learning content, and therefore the stress is on construction of meaning within social activity. Therefore, activity theory has significantly contributed to this, and problem solving, discovery learning, all these have significantly contributed to this. The activity theory categorical says that the activities need to be designed such that it would make meaning to the individual and all individuals who are involved within the activity. So, as Vygotsky would be talking about the general or proximal development, that one has to lead towards the leadership in skills, in knowledge skills and interest and attitude and so on and so forth in social activity in the community, as much as one would also significantly differ from what is going on and contribute to meaning making to that. So, therefore, enriched individual meaning making would contribute to social negotiation and therefore continuity in knowledge. What you finally see is the summary of cognitive, practical and social constructivism. For cognitive constructivism, the structure plays an important role. The individual cognitive structure is very important. Truth is objective reality. Reality is existing outside, and therefore to what extent one can feel in, or for that matter match with the existing external reality, and bring in one's own cognitive structure to play with that and therefore learn. And the stress is on accurate reality which exists outside, and how accurately one could learn. And this would certainly akin to more what behavioristic theory of learning would stress about, but it is different. It is radically different from behavioristic theory in the sense that it brings in a whole lot of internal processes within the individual vis-a-vis the external reality that exists outside. Second, the radical constructivism would stress on structure as well as meaning, that the structure of individual while interacting with external reality would also make meaning, and therefore even twins would differ in their meaning making. Two, that truth is experienced reality. The truth is not reality to be learned, the truth is a reality that needs to be experienced, and therefore experience between two individuals or among individuals would differ, and therefore understanding of knowledge or interpretation of that external reality would be different between individuals. Here the stress is on experiential reality which could be experienced in context. Social constructivism would stress on meaning and of less structure. So for these, meaning making and negotiation of meaning would be more important rather than sticking to the cognitive structure that one has, and therefore one has to interplay or play with the cognitive structure of one's own and I will talk about later that there will be strategies how to do with this, that one has to play with cognitive structure such that meaning making becomes more rather than conformity of the cognitive structure with external reality. Here the truth is socially constructed reality through co-participation in cultural practices, meaning thereby that one has to participate in activity. The activity is situated in a context, and the context has got culture built into that, and these are cultural practices, and therefore within cultural practices to do an activity or to engage in activities, that one has to socially negotiate the meaning which is socially constructed through group learning. And here the stress is social construction of reality. So reality which exists outside doesn't really exist outside. The reality has to be socially constructed and negotiated between individuals. That's how understanding takes place. That's how society moves on. So therefore the basic distinction that I will stress by this PowerPoint, by simply saying that one's own understanding or interpretation that reality exists outside and that is to be learned, and therefore teachers stimulus and response and so on and so forth, conditioning, reward and punishment, as behaviorists would say, would be very important insofar as learning is concerned. In contrast to that, here it is interpreted that reality is what is socially constructed by individuals together, and that's how knowledge is understood in context, and that's how society proceeds, and that's how knowledge builds on from time to time over centuries. This is the basic distinction between behaviorism and constructivism. Now let us look at, as you see on your screen, let us look at the traditional classroom and constructivist classroom. In a traditional classroom, even if it is a classroom, in a traditional teaching, the procedure is to proceed from simple to complex, part to the whole. In constructivist, it is better that to introduce the whole and then get it into parts. 2, that there is a fixed curriculum. In constructivism, it is most important that one has to negotiate the curriculum and teaching learning strategies as per students' interest. 3, that the textbooks are fixed, they are given, the textbooks are taught by the teachers within the classroom. But here the students are provided, in constructivist classroom, the students are provided with multiple resources, and what could proceed with selection of resources, and individual students would differ in their selection of resources, but they would be reaching the same learning objectives. So the pathways would be different, but the learning objectives would remain the same. 4, there will be instruction on the part of the teacher. And in constructivity classroom, because negotiation of meaning is very important, construction of meaning in social context and group is very important, therefore interaction becomes very important. 5, teachers become directive and authoritative, and in constructive classroom, teacher becomes a negotiator between students and individuals. When they would be interacting among themselves, the teacher would enrich the deliberation and bring in larger perspectives. And the next point is that assessment is a product, but in constructive classroom it would be seen as a process as well as a product, and process is more important than product. 7, knowledge is inert, but in constructive classroom knowledge is always dynamic. Knowledge is not given, knowledge evolves over a period of time, and that's how students would learn. 8, that students work alone largely through individual projects, assignments and so on and so forth. In a constructivist classroom, it is very important that the students work in groups. And 9, that there would be certainly no or low technologies involved in that, because teacher becomes very important and there will be audiovisual aids to that. But in constructivity classroom, assimilation of new technologies and how technologies play in teaching and learning, the process of technological intervention itself is very important for students to learn. So therefore, technological use in constructivity classroom would be more. Now let us look at the pedagogy and learning aspects of constructivism. As you see on your screen, that 1, that there should be authentic and real world environments. So whenever learning has to take place, when the learning environments have to be designed, when the learning resources need to be developed, the process of teaching learning takes place. One has to ensure, that simply means the teacher has to ensure that the real world environment is represented in learning, and whatever tasks are given in terms of learning, examples, explanations, tasks that are given, they have to be authentic. They have to simply represent real world environments, which we generally don't do. We theorize, we put in a lot of abstraction into that and conceptual clarification with a lot of linguistic use, language use that we do. We simply, because teaching learning is very simple, the simplicity is that to bring in the actual learning environments into context and bring in authenticity in tasks. The tasks should be authentic. 2, that social negotiation and mediation is very important between individual students and between teacher and students. This is very important insofar as learning is concerned. 3, that content and skills, they have to be relevant to the learner. So therefore, one type of textbook, one type of content, one type of teaching learning, one type of lecture to all students in the classroom would not fit in actually. It doesn't necessarily contribute to every student's learning. Therefore, what is important is that the content and the skills and teaching learning processes need to be geared towards individual learners. Learners' prior knowledge is very important, and continually assess the knowledge. That the formative assessment is very important. Students are taught. This is where the metacognitive skills, and Vygotsky talks about mental tools or mental science which need to be worked on, which needs to be manipulated insofar as one's learning is concerned. And Piaget talked about reflective abstraction, that at the reflective level that one has to bring in abstraction into one's own learning such that self-regulation, self-awareness and self-mediation are very important. Self-regulation is very important, that how one controls, handles, monitors and evaluates one's own learning process by oneself is very important. This is an important ingredient skill that needs to be developed in learners. Self-awareness is very important, and self-mediation is also very important. Teachers would act as facilitators, and teachers to give multiple perspectives and representations to what is being learned. And this is very important. The last point is very important. Multiple perspectives. Even if one has one's own ideology, one's own understanding as a teacher, one has a responsibility, I must say, to bring in multi perspectives to the interpretation of the reality or the context or the subject that is being discussed. This would facilitate diversified students groups to proceed in a very comfortable, in a very active, in a very engaging way of learning. Friends, what you would see, the pedagogical principles that we talked about in the previous PowerPoint, if we translate that, authentic learning that will be provided by virtual environment to stimulate the real world, and therefore there must be surrogate representation of the real world, real work environment into the virtual online learning environment. There should be both synchronous and asynchronous communication and interaction. Both are very important. 3. The synchronous virtual classes are immediately tailor-made to the student's understanding. Once it is synchronous, that one could address, like the classroom, the student's immediate needs, for which classroom learning is very important. Synchronous, asynchronous, the synchronous has to precede asynchronous, and therefore it works better. The quizzes and formative assessment are very important insofar as learning is concerned. They have to be continuously built into, and the feedback that have to be provided have to be constructive to each individual learner. Generally, quizzes just provide some feedback and score, then we get lost, and it doesn't mean that. We have to necessarily build into students' process of understanding, and therefore a student reflective journal and e-portfolio are very important to build insofar as formative assessment is concerned. On the process of online learning, educating students on the process of online learning is very important. Unless the students understand how the process of online learning really takes place, they must be very clear about that, otherwise learning would not be effective. E-moderating, e-tutoring is very important, and multiple content, multiple pathways, students' multiple representations are very important. Friends, this is my last PowerPoint to conclude by simply saying that how technologies would be helping learners. One is articulation of what they know. It must facilitate to articulate what they already know. 2, that there are technologies which will be facilitating reflection of what is learned. So, what they already know, they could articulate better. 2, what they are learning right now, they could also reflection on learning and reflection after learning. So, reflection within learning, while learning, and reflecting after learning would significantly contribute to one's own understanding of the content and therefore meaning making. 3, negotiate meaning internally, that one has to negotiate, understand and internalize meaning by oneself. There are abilities and skills, and including metacognition abilities, that would facilitate this. And finally, to construct personal meaning through social negotiation of meaning. What you see on your screen is that online discussion forums, both synchronous and asynchronous, online open education resources, hypertext links, hypermedia, web publishing, wikis, blogs, e-publication, email, listservs, news groups, chart, bulletin board, all these significantly contribute. I would stress here on e-portfolio. This must form a significant part of any teaching learning process that is happening, including a reflective journal. So therefore, friends, I must conclude by simply saying that Constructivism has significantly contributed to our understanding of teaching and learning, and more particularly online learning. Constructivism works better in online learning context, and online technologies that are listed here and some more technologies that are available today insofar as open source and open technologies that are available today and open source software that are available today to us would facilitate more constructivist way of learning. And therefore, to conclude that the constructivist way of learning would enrich one's own individual learning and group learning together. By simply saying, I would conclude that one must adopt an eclectic approach wherever appropriate, behavioristic, cognitivist and constructivist, and we will deal with connectivism in a later program. Thank you very much indeed.